All right, we are now joined on the Soccer Hour by Kasey Kazliner of Quakes Epicenter. And Kasey, I don't know, man, the Quakes are in a bit of a free fall. What I have been pointing out to people is that the Quakes won 9 of their first 10 games. Since then, they have won 1 of their next 10 games. That is polar opposite, a tale of 2 seasons through 20 games.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to see the holes get plucked a little bit more and just being exposed to the fullest extent. You know, we didn't see the back line give up a ton early in the season. This was touted as one of the best defensive teams, and now it's the complete opposite. You give up 4 goals out of the break to Orlando, and from there, it's a complete free fall, like you said. And so I think it's just, again, we're seeing inconsistencies that were present earlier in the season be heightened and more amplified with the absence of Daniel and plenty of other things I think we're going to talk about today, but just, again, it's being amplified to the fullest extent because the lack of depth, I think, is the main root of that issue.
Yeah, most definitely. And that was one of the concerns coming into the season for San Jose. People pointed it out, the lack of depth. But when you win 9 of your first 10 games, a lot of that tends to get overlooked because that was a historic start for any MLS club, not just the San Jose Earthquakes. This had been brewing for a bit, and I think there was the sense that because the schedule was so condensed, I think they, for April and May, were pretty much playing a game every 3.7 days. It also coincided their downturn with the loss of Timo Werner, who obviously did a lot for their attack, and then Nico Chakiris got injured right there at the start of May, and I think we could all see that without Nico, the team didn't possess as well, which when you're not possessing, you put more pressure on your defense. And now we've seen Nico back in a couple of games and Timo back now in every game since the break ended. Timo looks like himself. I think Nico looked more like himself last night. But I think it's very fascinating to me that it's Nico that has more of an impact on this team than Timo Werner, a former European star designated player. To me, the Quakes with and without Nico are a much bigger story than the Quakes with and without Timo Werner.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think Nico, just because of his creativity, his skill, it's not that Timo doesn't have that, but it's more so Timo's role is a lot more specialized on this team. He's not necessarily leading attacks the way that Nico does. He's crossing a lot to the middle. He's trying to find teammates in space. Nico is creating that space for himself when he's fully healthy and fully able to create an impact on the field. And that's why it seemed like everyone else was relying on him. And I think we're seeing now, he's easing back into a role that feels comfortable for him. And I agree with you. I think he looked a lot better last night. But, it's just astonishing and really interesting to see guys like Usaini Buda, Preston Judd. I could list plenty more that just completely rely on him, it seems like, because without him, they look like completely different players. And it's not like they're not talented players. I think Usaini Buda is an extremely talented soccer player. He's very skilled. He's very fast. He's a very good player and had a role on this team as a striker for a bit, for a reason. But I think we're starting to see that, there's been some load bearing. I think that's been the kind of term that's been floating around Nico Chakiris with his impact. And it's crazy because he's barely legal at this point. He's a young guy and he, is carrying the load because of his creativity on a team that is lacking a lot of it. I mean, Timo Werner is a creative player, but his role is a lot more, like you talked about, he's kind of back to himself, but it's still a lot more of a defined role. Whereas Nico, is a lot more creative in the middle and creating his space. You don't see a ton of that from Timo a lot, but he's still a very valuable player, of course.
The stat that I got last night was the Quakes record when Nico Chakiris plays most of the second half, 23 plus minutes, 9-1-1. When he doesn't, 1-6-2. I mean, that's extremely telling. And Nico, coming back from injury, has not played the second half in the last 2 games, both of which have been losses for San Jose. But this is, to me, going beyond just the eye test to where you see the difference, on field and how the Quakes play, which I think was very evident last night against LA. The Quakes were oftentimes the better team, but they were specifically more of the better team when they had Nico on the field in the first half, even when it was not a man advantage like it was for the entirety of the second half. But I mean, this is just, it's clear that Nico is this good. And what I wonder is just how much interest there is in him overseas, how long he's going to be a member of the Earthquakes, because really the only thing holding him back right now are the injuries, which have been relatively consistent. Hopefully this most recent time around with the surgery on his groin that kept him out since the start of May until the last couple of games. I mean, his future, like you said, he's so young. I feel like this could be a situation where teams around the world are going to come knocking because he has such an extreme impact. And we saw Bruce saying that he expects him to be part of the United States next cycle for the World Cup.
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, it's not the first time we've seen a young player or young players for the Quakes get interest, and not like there is a ton publicly yet, but I'm sure, like you talked about, there is. And I even think about a guy like Bo LaRue. I know he's not necessarily a Nico Chakiris in the sense that he carries the Quakes sometimes, but there's young players that you kind of have to worry about getting poached in that sense, just because of what the Quakes were able to brew earlier in the season. I mean, if they weren't losing, I doubt we'd be having these conversations, just because of the impact that both those guys have had, but specifically Nico, like we talked about earlier. So I'm very curious as well. I think, again, you start fresh next year. You have the new calendar. You hopefully can stay healthy if you're Nico Chakiris, but I think there was a lot of kind of concerns about his injury history, just because of maybe the reluctancy to play him last year, even when he was healthy. I mean, he wasn't on injury reports last year and still not being played. Then you go into this year and he completely explodes. And I think he maybe had Bruce Arena eating his words a little bit about, Nico Chakiris's ability to be on the field and ability to make an impact. But I definitely think that the spotlight is there for him, especially if he keeps standing out on a team that just cannot perform day to day. And I think he's probably frustrated as well when you have a striker position right now that is just not producing, goals at this point, and he's creating a lot of opportunities for him. It's probably a bit frustrating for a guy that just does so much for this team and finds the strikers in space.
As we look kind of more at the 30,000 foot view of San Jose, the pendulum has swung so far in one direction to the other. Is there a sense that there's going to be kind of a midline here as we get back for the final, 10, 14 games of the year? Because they played the first 10, they were lights out. These next 10, only one win. Is there going to be that regression to the mean now, or are these issues for San Jose things that they can't rectify right now?
I think more likely than not, there will be a regression to the mean, simply because they're in a playoff spot. I think if they were if this was 2024 and they were bottom of the league and they were completely, because even that season they had, some bright moments, early wins and stuff like that, but then it just completely went downhill. Last year was kind of like this year in the sense that they had a very solid start to the season, very promising start, and then it just all completely fell down. And this season, it's been a little bit more of a prolonged good start, and then, here in the second half of the season, they're completely falling downhill. I think being in a playoff spot has to be motivating, even though I think a lot of people, myself included, agree that the morale of this team and just the overall motivation and sense of urgency is very low. But I think just being in a playoff spot right now is definitely motivating. I know they're only up 6 points on the last spot in the playoffs. I think Portland is the 9th spot right now. The Quakes are kind of just hanging in there just because LAFC and Vancouver are struggling a little bit right now as well. So that West top part of the table is kind of open. But, I think if you're Angus Gunn and you're the back line, you're still kind of getting adjusted out of the break. It's been over a month now. I'm not, justifying that. I know Angus Gunn could be a lot better, but I think he was thrown into a very tough position that Bruce Arena kind of threw him into the fire, and he hasn't been able to climb out of it. So I think there's blame to be assigned on both sides, but I think, we've seen him improve at times. I think, this past game was probably his best one. The bar is low considering the other games that he's been a part of so far as an Earthquake, but I have hope that, if the backline can tighten up a little bit, Angus Gunn will gain some of that confidence back, because I think his confidence is probably at an all-time low, at least as an Earthquake at this point. I know he's done a lot at the international level and overseas too, but I do have faith that they can improve across the upcoming schedule if they respond to that sense of urgency and of course stay healthy as well. Losing Ronaldo Vieira, I know he's struggled mightily recently, but it does just add to that conversation of lack of depth and not having a stopper in the middle. I know he's struggled a lot, but just having him present is helpful, by and large. So
yeah, I was going to bring up Vieira next anyway, so we'll go there. Why do you think he has not looked the same on this side of the World Cup break? Because I just feel like his pace isn't there. I feel like he has not been able to have the same impact on games. I don't see anything tactically different in the way that teams are approaching the Quakes midfield and to break through to the final third, it just feels like he's not as comfortable and as active out there.
Yeah, I don't think it's a cerebral thing. I think you're right. I think it's more so maybe a fitness thing, and just maybe just getting back to the flow of things. But again, you can make that excuse the first couple games back, especially after a wake up call to Orlando where you lose 4-0. But it's been a while now. It's been, 5 matches now post World Cup, and I think just him not being able to kind of fill in with the communication maybe on the back line. There were some games I was at the last home game, and it felt like on at least one of the St. Louis goals, the communication between the back line and Vieira was not really there. I think tactically he's a very sound player, but again, the pacing combined with maybe not being aware of the position he's supposed to be in, I think kind of hurt his game a little bit in that one. And then of course you see him miss last night's game to LA Galaxy, and that's probably a fitness thing. Like, of course, being on the injury report, it would be, but I think you saw some of that impact him against St. Louis. So I think he's gotten a lot slower. I don't know if that's related to an injury thing. It probably has something to do with it, but also just maybe not conditioning his body the way he was supposed to over the World Cup break. That's not a knock on his game necessarily, but I think maybe just again the training staff not responding to the injury that was maybe lingering or something of that nature. Just because again we saw him be such a great stopper and in position end of last year and earlier in this season, and it just feels like the communication with the back line with Angus Gunn and the defensive midfield has not really been there, combined with his lack of pacing and speed.
One of the things that's also frustrated me with the Earthquakes and the way the timing has gone down in the last LA Galaxy game, they didn't have Vieira due to a yellow accumulation. They didn't have Judd due to accumulation. And then in this most recent game, they don't have Reed Roberts due to yellow accumulation, and they don't have Vieira because he was out injured. And it's like these are two games amidst all these Western Conference opponents they've been taking on where it's like you need the full strength. You need to get those 3 points. I mean, I know we can talk about the pain of losing to Orlando or an FC Cincinnati, but to me, one of the turning points is JT Marcinkowski making that stop on Timo Werner in stoppage time from the spot. I mean, that right now, that was such a gut punch to the Earthquakes when it felt like they could have bounced back, gotten a big 3 points in their second game after the break, but instead they've only earned 1 point through 5 games.
Yeah, and to your former goalie too, really hurts.
Yeah.
I know Timo Werner wasn't there, wasn't probably aware of that. That would be a gut puncher the way it was, because I think a lot of Quakes fans see the goalie situation now and think, what if? I know Daniel emerged, right after Marcinkowski's reign in San Jose, but I think that's definitely a morale herder for San Jose fans, but also just like you talked about, that was a game that they felt like they should have won. And we know how big of a rivalry this is for the fans and the team and everyone involved, but also LA Galaxy, a team that was very lowly to start the year, is right there in contention for a playoff spot. They needed those 3 points, arguably more than San Jose did last night, and they snatched them toward the end there on a very big defensive collapse for San Jose. But again, I agree with you. I think there were issues. I think there were issues before the World Cup break. I think a lot of people assign blame to it now just because of the correlation between getting rid of Daniel and bringing in Angus Gunn and some of the injuries and whatnot. But they weren't perfect before the break either. Daniel was bailing them out of games, and the back line was getting exposed a lot in those games as well. And there were questions of, is this sustainable? Because I think you and I had talked about a lot of people doubting the Quakes even after they beat teams like LAFC, San Diego, before we knew that they would be the team that they are now, low at the table. But and the question kind of was that they're beating a lot of teams right now, but is it sustainable? Is it without the depth and also the back line just being very loose in their playing style? Is it sustainable? And I think we're just seeing that amplified and heightened a lot more just because of the goalie situation. You don't have Daniel to bail you out of games. And I was thinking about this a little bit last night. Daniel and the Quakes had a pretty symbiotic relationship, because although Daniel was having to do everything for the Quakes made him look a lot better than, he is a very talented goalie, don't get me wrong, but just because of the defensive inconsistencies, there were opportunities every single game for Daniel to make big saves, save the Quakes from losing or conceding or whatnot. And obviously he helped the Quakes win games. And so they had a very symbiotic relationship. And that's why the divorce between the two is very surprising to me. And I think now we'll see Daniel, he's on an FC Dallas team that is very solid, and he's going to go do great things there. But in San Jose, I understand why he's frustrated, because he had to carry the load, but also maybe the Quakes' lack of backline focus and lack of depth there made him look a lot better. Not saying he's not as good as he's advertised,
Yeah.
but I think it's a very interesting thing to think about when you think about why the two ultimately came to a divorce.
Yeah, I mean, with Daniel, his issue, even going back to his earlier days in Brazil, was always health, and that's the issue now with FC Dallas. Is he already took a knock, but he is extremely talented, and I think that's why fans have been maybe a little bit unfair to Angus Gunn. Not that he's been amazing. I mean, he was good last night, make some big stops, but I think, like you alluded to, you get thrown into a difficult situation, new back line, you're figuring everything out. The back line's not great in front of you. You're learning, the timing of the league. And you're comparing Gunn, who just played in the World Cup, against a keeper who in Major League Soccer was one of the best shot stoppers. I mean, Daniel was not perfect, but he could pull saves out of nowhere. And you'd think, man, how on earth did he make that stop? And that's a tough comparison for Gunn. I want to give Gunn more time to be able to settle in the back line, to organize around him, because I think that A, needs to happen for the team to have success, and B, fans need to see if it can be cohesive, because it's very easy to see a new situation and say, oh, well, clearly this isn't working. It's like, I know it's an overused phrase, but small sample size.
It is a small sample size, and I think it's also a trickle-down sort of effect we're seeing, because the more that the midfield creates giveaways for the other team and the back line is not in position. I mean, we saw that very clearly in the St. Louis game. We definitely saw that in the Orlando and Cincinnati games. We didn't see it as much in both the LA Galaxy matchups, but the midfield has just got to be better as well. I know bringing back Nico helps, and I think some of that sample size, the bulk of it, is without Nico Chakiris. So I think it is unfair to Gunn to compare, 5 games to the body of work that Daniel was able to produce in San Jose. But with that being said, he is ultimately the guy that needs to communicate a little bit better. I think that's been a big talking point just about his overall game. I know he's in a new place. He's, like you talked about, in a new back line, a new system, under a head coach that clearly has an agenda of how he wants to run things and picks players by hand. And so it's a very hard adjustment. I'm not going to shy away from that when talking about Angus Gunn, but at the same time, the rest of the team has to be there to support him. And I'm not in the locker room. I don't know what the conversations and morale are like, but I think after going winless your first 5 games after a very long break, it has to be pretty low just based on, the law of losing. But at the same time, you're still in a postseason spot. That's the silver lining that I'm going to keep going back to, given that this time last year, playoffs were such a wild card type of talking point, I guess. And now it's a very clear reality that they could make the postseason. I know that they're not in a prime spot to, clinch anytime soon or even be talking about playoff possibilities. But I think that should boost the confidence of guys like Angus Gunn, who know that they can be playing important games sooner rather than later. But also, again, I think it just goes back to the midfield of needing to protect the ball more. I mean, that's just been such a big issue this season, whether, with Nico Chakiris or without. I mean, we saw that with him against St. Louis. Even with him, they were not able to keep the ball careful. And I think that goes back to Ronaldo Vieira, the conversation of him as well, and Hussein Buda and other guys there that have not been, up to their top part of their game. But it all trickles back. And I think that's why Gunn is going to get the most blame. But I agree with you. I think there's blame to be assigned pretty much to every position. I don't think that Gunn is the outlier. I think he's a little bit of a scapegoat right now just because he's new. But I don't think that he's been great either. So I don't want to say he's not done anything bad, because he has. But it's still a small sample size.
What did you think of Jovanovic last night in his first start?
I thought all things considered, he was pretty solid. He has to be a little bit more present, I think, sometimes. I think that's something we've seen with Judd, where, he's quiet for the bulk of the game, and then he gets the ball and doesn't make the most of it. And I thought, in the first game with Jovanovic, very solid in his role, because he was playing a little bit more like a midfielder in that first game, just because he kind of had to. There wasn't a ton of leg room for him to slot up to the top. But I thought he was solid. Again, they had opportunities early in the game. It wasn't like he was on an island or quiet. I did think, when Preston Judd came in and struggled a bit, that there was, a little bit of a maybe kind of desire to have someone else there. So I kind of like Luka so far. I like his speed. I think he's very skilled. But what do you think of him?
I mean, I think that he was, in these first 2 games, like you alluded to, he's having trouble kind of settling in, figuring out where he needs to be, because he's learning the team. But when he didn't have the ball at his foot, I liked his decision making. I liked what he was trying. I think that he has the ability to score goals, and he was denied by JT Marcinkowski, on a very, very good save. But I think I would not be surprised if he's scoring goals consistently very, very shortly here in this league, because a lot of that Australian mentality has a great overlap here in Major League Soccer and in the American soccer landscape. I've talked to Dieter Kurtenbach about this, a Bay Area news group in KMBR, and he says that Australia's national team reminds him very much of how the U.S. men's national team used to be, that it was a lot of grit, grind, and determination. Even when you didn't have all the skill in the world, that they were going to punch above their weight. And I think that's part of that mentality with the Australian players, which is what the Quakes need more of that injection of punching right now. I think the morale that you mentioned, I do think this team was flying at such a high. Their confidence was so high, even when they weren't winning all those games throughout the month of May after Nico went down going into the break. But they felt that without Timo, without Nico, they could still go out there and get a win. They got their first ever win in Portland in MLS League play. That, to me, is one of the things that's really changed about this team, is that sky-high confidence, which I know it's not a tangible or a quantifiable, but you could feel it when they went into games, and that right now is not the same as it was.
Yeah, momentum too, right? Like they were riding high on that, and that's not a tangible or quantifiable thing either, but they definitely had it early in the season. And I think part of that sort of determination was, and you alluded to it, kind of rallying behind the injuries. I felt, you lose DeJuan Jones really early in the season. I know he's not a Nico or Timo type of player, but he's still a big part of this team. Got a lot of looks toward the end of last season as one of the better defenders on this team. And I think they rallied behind that. And I think the emergence of Nico and Bo, I mean, I know that they're probably not thinking about this day to day, but I think the fans, knowing that these are homegrown guys, encourage people to show up and show out and support. And and also just the excitement of having a player like Timo Werner, who has played at the highest level before. I think a lot of those tangible and intangible things kind of like collided and became a really special thing for the Quakes early in the season. Having the homegrown talent, having a head coach that is committed to winning, and all these things. And it feels like, I don't know what it was about the World Cup break, because I mean, every team had to deal with that, and it's not something that, should be, I think, used to blame anything really anymore at this point, 5 games post World Cup break. But it definitely took a toll on this team, whether it's a mentality thing, whether it's a fitness thing. And it's ironic, right? Because this team was pretty beat up before the World Cup break. And I think going back to the grit thing, I mean, Preston Judd was such a big part of that. I know he kind of coined that for himself last year, coming on as a sub usually for the Quakes when they needed him most. And this season, he carved out a starting role for himself and still kind of carried on that grit mentality. With Quakes need goals late. You go back to that Austin game earlier in the season where they're losing and they come back. The first St. Louis matchup in St. Louis, where they need to come back and they just somehow find a way. The Quakes are always going to find a way, with sort of the never say die mentality. And it feels like that's just completely gone away. And I think that's sort of goes back to the morale of, maybe a lack of sense of urgency, or maybe the team not being happy about some of the moves being made, bringing in players or shipping them out. I mean, again, not there to speculate, but I think at the same time, when you lose, certain players to injury, and then you also get rid of your keeper, who we don't know. Well, I don't know.
They didn't get rid of him. He wanted to leave.
Yeah.
I know that's what Bruce said, but I mean, that is the thing. He wanted to, and I don't know why you want to leave the Bay Area, but I guess he did.
Yeah. And I mean, again, not to speculate again, but the reasons why maybe he wanted to leave could be affecting other players too, excuse me. So again, I mean, the Daniel situation is definitely very interesting, because I think it's odd, because hearing Bruce Arena say that, and then, hearing from you and hearing from other sources as well about just the other side of it is very interesting. And then also just leaving mid-season. I know that the calendar is weird with the World Cup and everything, but leaving to an in-conference opponent and just, again, at this point in the season, I know that it kind of contradicts what I said about the symbiotic relationship, but I think at the same time, it's just a very odd situation.
Yeah, and I mean that's sports. There's going to be odd situations at times, but yeah, I mean anything that disrupts. I mean, regardless of what why somebody wanted to leave, it's still disruptive for everyone. There's a change. Change is hard to deal with. It doesn't have to be just sports. We all know that from day-to-day life. Change is not the easiest thing to adapt to. And I just wonder if the Earthquakes are at a point where they just kind of need to get over the hump to have that one thing that happens to where they get that win on the other side. Everybody relaxes and they can kind of get back to what they were desiring to do or the way they were playing before the World Cup break.
Yeah, they just need one win. I mean, I thought the one result against the Galaxy the first time where you get a draw would set them in a better direction just because, we weren't seeing anything before that.
Yeah.
And especially with how that game ended and how frustrating it was and just, not having two of your anchor players, to suspension and whatnot. I think that would have rallied them. I mean, like I talked about earlier, this is a team that earlier in the season would have rallied behind adversity. And I mean, again, refereeing affects every team to some extent. What goes around comes around. But I think there were games where the Quakes felt like they were unfairly treated by the referees. And I think that motivated them a lot. I mean, Preston Judd is a very fiery player. I keep going back to him because although he's not the captain of this team, he's a player that sort of acts in such a way sometimes. I know recently has been different, but earlier in the year, he is a fiery player. He's not afraid to tell you off if you're an opponent. I think Timo Werner has gotten a little bit more of that. We saw some pushing and shoving in the St. Louis game and protecting teammates. I think that's big for a team that's morale is probably kind of low to be able to pick guys up, but it also maybe shows some of the frustrations brewing. So again, you have Minnesota United FC next. That's a team that has also been affected by load management with Leagues Cup and whatnot, but a team that's also struggled a little bit recently. It's not going to be an easy game for the Quakes. Minnesota is a very solid team that has given them a lot of trouble recently in the past as well. But again, I think one win for this team will do wonders. I think you're going to see a different demeanor from Bruce. Hopefully, I think you're going to see Angus Gunn's confidence skyrocket because that's what it comes down to. I mean, again, last night the offense didn't score any goals, but Angus Gunn played a lot better, and they had an opportunity to take that game last night. So again, I think that one win will set them in the right direction. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to make them a contender again like they were a few weeks ago or a month ago, but I think it will propel them maybe into a motivating place where, they realize that the playoffs are a new season. I mean, none of these guys in a Quakes uniform, really, maybe outside of a couple off the top of my head, I can't think, have played in the playoffs with the Quakes. I don't think anyone has, at least.
No, I mean, Buda was there in 23. Nico was, but was not featuring as much. I think Nico subbed on in that game against Sporting Kansas City, if I remember off the top of my head. I don't know if Buda featured, but yeah, I mean, there's not tons of playoff experience. There's only one way to get it.
Right. And I mean, they played in Open Cup games. They played in some of the guys have played in Leagues Cup, but it's just, again, knowing that they're going to be playing important games. I know that's another intangible thing. I think that should be motivating, but that's still more than 10 games away. So I think you have to be able to again, just get that one win and hope that it sets you in the right direction. And I don't know what they can do in terms of bringing on guys. I know there's probably guys with Quakes 2 experience that could be, good enough. I know a lot of people have talked about Francesco Montali I know he's spent time with the top club, but I'm not saying, get rid of Angus Gunn right now, but I think if Montali continues to show good results in training, and I know he's done very well in Quakes 2 and Town FC, I think, maybe give him an opportunity one of these games, maybe a midweek game where you're going to rotate the squad anyways. You never know. So, yeah.
Looking at Saturday, what do you want to see from San Jose?
I want to see just a more balanced approach. I feel like they've been kind of boomer bust at times with these long lobbing passes and just, again, not setting up the offense more organically. I mean, they've talked about being such a good team off set pieces all season. And some of that is being a good set piece team when you have Timo Werner and you have Nico Chakiris with those duties. But some of that's also because they're not scoring a lot of goals organically off, created chances off, the counter press. I want to see them do that a lot more. I want to see Angus Gunn communicate to the back line. I know he's probably gotten better at that, getting adjusted in the month or so he's been in San Jose. And I also want to see the back line play a lot tighter and more compact. I think we've seen these past two games specifically, and more, of course, as well, that just the looseness of the back line and coming out too far and too ambitiously has really plagued them. I know it's worked at times with, earlier in the season, being able to get the ball to Nico and Timo and letting them do their thing, but I think it's been too risky. I want to see them play a little bit more protected and a little bit more contained and a little more carefully. I think this is a team that likes to play kind of a risky style at times, but I think when you've gone winless your last 5, I think you have to maybe revert back to the basics. I'm not the coach, but I think it's important to sort of go back to those fundamentals to get that one win like I talked about. And again, I don't want them to force Timo Werner too much either. I think that was maybe didn't see that as much last night just because he came on in the second half. But in the St. Louis game, they were forcing him a lot too much. And I think that's why we didn't see a great game from Nico Chakiris, because he wasn't really getting those prime opportunities that they were sort of shoveling to Timo. And I think some of that's getting Nico Chakiris a lot more adjusted back in. But I want to see them distribute a little bit more evenly, even get Bo LaRue a little bit more involved, because I think he's sort of a secret weapon at times.
Yeah, no, more possession as opposed to the boomer bust. I'm all for that. But Kasey, I know you got stuff to do, so I will let you go, but I appreciate your time as always, and I'll see you soon. All right, man?
Thank you so much, Ted. Appreciate you.